We've got a fabulous panel here. On my left is Jack Rakove of Stanford University, where he's the William Coe Professor of History and American Studies and a Professor of Political Science. Seated next to him is Yascha Mounk, the Director of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and a lecturer at Harvard University. And next to him is Michele Moody-Adams, the Stratis Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia University, where she is also the former Dean of Columbia College. And we're going to start here with some opening thoughts, but then we'll move as quickly as we can toward conversation so that we can, you'll have a chance to ask your questions as well, and we'll try to engage with a topic that I think has some real pressing urgency. I think that if you'd asked previous generations about the endurance of democracy, there was generally a sense that the threats to democracy were external, that competing systems, fascism, communism, were in a struggle with the democratic West for global domination, but that internally democracy was sound. I think, and we'll talk more about this, that assumption has been widely shaken in the last decade or two, and it suddenly makes this not sort of an abstract theoretical question that we're posing, to which you all already know the answers, but something that's actually very much worth exploring in the present. Why don't we start with Jack? Can you tell us a little bit about how Americans in the founding generation and in the past have thought about the tensions around democracy?
Well, I think the best way to do this, which may or may not be directly responsive to Yodi's question, would be to start by offering two very quick definitions of democracy. And I'll say one would have been a reasonable definition for, let's say, the 1780s, the moment when the federal Constitution was written. And then the second one would be more apposite, let's say, the age of Jackson, when Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States and then went back to France and wrote his famous 2 volumes, Democracy in America. The founders would not have thought of themselves as being Democrats. I'm sure many of you know that the preferred political term that they would have used to describe their great project of constitution making would be Republican and not Democratic by nature, and so therefore we would have to distinguish what one means by a republic from what one means by democracy. I think the primary definition, let's say in the 1770s, 1780s, for what one mean by a democracy would be to look at a set of very particular practices, let's say from 5th or 4th century BCE Athens, or 1 or 2 aspects from classical Rome, to look at features of primarily local governance where citizens participated directly in decision making, not by elective processes, not by choosing representatives, but by becoming part of a particular institution where for a fairly limited period of time, it might be 10 days, it might be 6 months, it might be a year, you would actually be the decision maker. In Anglo-American practice, the best early modern counterpart to this would be the jury, would arguably be the most democratic institution of all. So that, for example, when James Madison wrote the 10th Federalist, which we take to be kind of the classic, the ur-text of American constitutional theory, Madison tries to define democracy out of the American equation. He uses that classical definition, an institution where citizens make the decisions directly. Says we're not going to talk about that. For us, that's become a null category. 40-some years later, when Tocqueville comes to the United States, not quite as a political refugee, but at a moment when it's good for him to be out of France, and he travels pretty substantially around the country and interviews and meets people everywhere, and takes elaborate notes, and then goes back and thinks about this. When Tocqueville writes Democracy in America, he's not describing anything like the founder's notion or the Madisonian notion I just described. Tocqueville sees democracy really almost as a civilization. It's a whole set of political institutions. He wants to describe how they work. They have some important origins in American culture. Tocqueville placed a great deal of emphasis on the New England town meeting, and I think also on congregational churches. He's aware of the federal system. He's aware of the electoral system. He sees democracy really as a whole culture, as a whole way of life, as a civilization which is coming. And France is going to be subject to this just as much as the Americans were. So what's taken place over a period, let's say, of two or so political generations is there's been a remarkable evolution in the concept of what democracy itself meant, from something we're really going to try to avoid to becoming the basic instrument. And I think the last point I'll make on this is if you wanted to qualify Madison back in the late 1780s, Madison wants to get democracy out of the equation entirely. But many of his contemporaries would have spoken of democratic, or what they sometimes said, democratical institutions. They would have talked first and foremost about representative government, and they would have seen, particularly the lower houses of American legislatures, whether the House of Representatives or in the states, they would have seen those as the most democratic institutions of all. So thinking about, I think, the growth of legislative power and the development of practices of representative government, including the emergence of political parties, I think that would be the kind of dynamic element that explains how democracy, in a robust sense, first emerges here.
So we've got this definition of democracy then as a civilization, interlocking array of institutions and political culture that emerges in the United States over the early decades. Yascha, you've done a fair amount of research about shifting attitudes toward democracy in the United States and elsewhere, and have been thinking about why those shifts are taking place. How is our approach to this civilizational culture changing?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I had to think of while you were speaking is the degree to which I think a lot of citizens, a lot of young people have actually sort of forgotten what the basis of our democratic system is, and don't know this history very well, and don't have a working definition of democracy in their mind. I'm sure that you know, I would struggle if you worked me up a tree to give a coherent definition of democracy. I'm sure that's true of a lot of people in this room. One of my favorite parts of Federalist to teach is not Federalist 10, but one of the later Federalist papers where also I believe Hamilton distinguishes between a democracy and a republic and says that, you know, what democracy is of people ruling themselves directly and so on. But the real distinction of a republic is, capital letters, the total exclusion of a people in their collective capacity from any share in the government. And teaching this to 18-year-old Harvard undergrads has a bit of an impact. People are a little shaken up by that, so it's an interesting thing. But to get to your question, I think, first of all, that it's quite clear that what you need for democracy to work is not just institutions, it's a set of cultures, it's a set of public attitudes. The problem with the constitution we try to pass in Iraq or in Afghanistan, or for that matter in Russia or in Turkey, is not the badly written constitutions by idiots who didn't know what they were doing. They were very smartly written constitutions by some of the best political scientists we have available. But it was very difficult to make democracy stick in those countries because they didn't have democratic cultures of a kind that Tocqueville had described for America in the 19th century. And my fear is that even in countries where we've taken those democratic cultures and that attachment to democratic values really for granted for a very long time, we're now slowly starting to see the erosion of those. So I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but for example, in the United States, you ask people, how important is it to you to live in a democracy? Among people born in the 1930s and 1940s, over 2/3 say, really important, crucial, 10 out of 10. You ask people born since 1980, so-called millennials, how important it is to them, and less than 1/3 says that it's really important to them. And even the openness to authoritarian alternatives to democracy is increasing. So 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that they were open to army rule. Now it's 1 in 6. It's more than doubled over the course of 20 years. So the real question is, why is this happening? What is changing in our world to make this happen? And I think we need to do a couple of things. We need to look beyond the United States because we see the rise of populism in a whole set of countries in North America, Western Europe, and beyond that. So it can't be a specifically American story. It's got to have common causes. And we should beware of thinking of different causes in competition to each other. The world is not monocausal. Often different things are going on at the same time. And so it seems to me that at least 3 things are crucial, and there may be others as well. One of which being a real stagnation in living standards from one generation to the next. So from 1935 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubles. From 1960 to 1985, it doubles again. And since 1985, it's been stagnant. And that makes a real difference in how people think about the political system, because the reason why they liked it for a long time was that it gave something to them. That they could look back at their childhood and say, you know what, I grew up without a fridge or a car, or access to healthcare, and now I have, you know, a fridge and a freezer and 2 cars and a decent doctor and a home entertainment system to boot. How bad can the system be? And a lot of people no longer feel that. A lot of people feel that they've worked hard all their lives and they don't have anything to show for it. So that's one driver of this. I think a second driver is the slow transition of mono-ethnic, monocultural countries into multi-ethnic ones. It's clearest in Western Europe, where in countries like Germany, where I grew up, there is a very clearly ethnically based conception of who belongs. I, being Jewish, didn't quite belong. There was enough. Certainly, if you were from Turkey, or if you were black, or if you were Asian, you did not belong. If you're Muslim, you do not belong. And these countries became democracies when they were very, very homogeneous in the wake of World War II. And are now slowly having to confront the fact that they've had a lot of immigration, that these immigrants are there to stay, that they also want to consider themselves German or French or Italians, but they feel excluded from the society. And there's parts of the society that have managed to transition towards a new understanding of what the nation means, of what membership in the nation means, who are embracing that, who are welcoming that. There's also big parts of the population who are rebelling against that and acting out, frankly, because of that rebellion. The United States is a little different in that it's always been a multi-ethnic society, but it's always been a deeply hierarchical multi-ethnic society in which one racial group had all of the privileges. We've actually come very far in overcoming that, despite all of the ongoing injustices. This country is a much more racially just place today than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. And again, there's a part of the population that embraces and celebrates that, and a part of the population that is uncomfortable and, with that and reacts against that. And the third reason is social media. Used to have a system in which a political and financial elite had control of the means of communication, where to be heard by a large number of people, you had to have a newspaper, a radio station, a television station. All the people running it had to think, this person has something to say that we like. We're going to bring them on. And now we've gone from one-to-many communication that was restricted to a few people, to one-to-many communication where everybody can have a website and spread their ideas. So you see the rise of things like Breitbart very quickly. And then we've gone from one-to-many communication to many-to-many communication through the spread of Twitter and Facebook and so on. So that even if you just have 50 Facebook followers, if you say something that they find really captivating, if you share a video of a shocking political event and they share that, you can reach many, many, many people very, very quickly. And so the advantage that the political and financial elite had over the rest of the population has shrunk. That is a good thing in many dictatorships around the world, where it allows a pro-democratic opposition to rebel. It is to some degree a good thing in our society because it makes elites more accountable, but it also allows much more extreme voices and often more hateful voices to have a bigger role in the government. So I think to start thinking about what to do about this moment, we have to start thinking about how to return real growth to average people, how to build a national multi-ethnic identity that emphasizes what we have in common as well as what separates us. And we have to think about how to reinvigorate attachment to democratic norms and to basic liberal principles in an age of social media and so on.
So I know that we have a diagnosis now from Yascha of what has gone wrong in the West and other democracies. I know you've been thinking about some prescriptions that could be constructively applied here in the United States and elsewhere. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
I will start with a very brief preface, and that's that it's impossible to think about this question about whether democracy has run its course without hearing the echo of Plato and Book 8 of the Republic, the argument that democracy always intrinsically tends to destroy itself from within and in effect to lead to the creation of a dictator to save us from ourselves. And I think to the extent that Plato thought it was the values of liberty and equality run amok, and certain kinds of deficiencies in those of us who are citizens, both intellectual and moral deficiencies, any kind of renewal that you propose has to try to respond to the objections on those two fronts. And I think the first thing to do is to recognize that there are levels of concern at which our efforts at renewal have to take place. And the first is the level of laws, institutions, and practices. And I think here there's three very quick things we could throw out to talk about. One of them is that we have to have institutions and laws that protect the rule of law. We heard a panel about that earlier today. We have to have, I think, a new way of thinking about the electoral process, not just in the US, but in the UK and so forth, but especially in the US, maybe to limit the impact of money, and also, I think, to kind of rethink the way in which people understand the importance of their participation in elections, that democracies don't work unless people actually go to the polls and put themselves up for election, and the local and national. I think also we have to demand of our institutions that we resist the idea that more voting is better democracy. So we have a kind of permanent campaign in the US where, you know, the minute somebody gets elected, boom, let's start the re-election campaign. Changes the character of political debate, makes it people push to the extreme, they talk to their base, and they're not doing the business of government. And I think this is a problem not just for the US. Anybody looking at Brexit and then to Mrs. May's recent decision to have another election so soon after, I think the idea that somehow more voting is more democratic, I think, is a problem. Secondly, there's the level of our leaders. We've got to expect of them, first of all, that they care at least some of the time about the public interest and not just about partisan political commitments. And that's a very hard thing, but we've got to start holding them accountable. And one way in which we do that is to demand transparency, to insist that certain important issues, healthcare, for instance, have to be debated in the open, even if we don't all agree at the start. It's not democratic, my argument would be, not to allow the debate to occur. The second thing I would say, we've got to demand of our leaders that they be willing to compromise. Compromise is the important alternative, I think, to what, if we can't always get a kind of true consensus, the next best thing is constructive compromise. We've reached a moment in the history of many democracies where compromise is a dirty word, and that's unsustainable. Thirdly, I think we have to expect of our leaders that they be willing to kind of clean up the nature of public discourse. There's so many ways in which this matters. The denigration of government itself, from my mind, the kind of inconsistency of running for government office and then wanting to denigrate government, to me, is deeply problematic. But the denigration of people, both internal people who are sort of citizens and who are kind of, you know, domestically one of us, but also others who might be alien, but who are still human. And the tendency to need to denigrate people in order to express our disagreement with them, I think, is dangerous. Thirdly, and finally, there are three things we have to demand of ourselves as citizens. The first, I think, is that we have got to be ready to say that we need to renew the political culture that was described by both of my fellow panelists in different ways. And that's partly a matter of renewing our commitment to certain civic virtues that make democracy, stable democracy, possible. Compromise, a willingness to forego resentment when you lose in a political contest, and to forego self-righteousness when you win. I mean, just to put a few examples out there. Secondly, I think we have to accept that there is a period of transition to this renewal, but the transition may require us to rethink the way what we consider to be politics. And I think there are lessons to be learned from the theory of organizational behavior, from people who do conflict management and so forth, that we've reached a kind of point of divisiveness in our culture that we may need to get people to sit us down, I can give examples later, and talk to each other in a way, sometimes when we're not deciding anything, but to talk to each other in a way that can start to generate mutual respect. And then thirdly and finally, I would argue that we have got to understand that when we do have conflicts that are difficult to resolve, maybe because some deep-seated injustice or deep-rooted injustice is at stake, when we seek redress of our grievances, redress of injustice, like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King, like Mandela, Nelson Mandela, we have to seek redress that leaves open the possibility of reconciliation with the people with whom we disagree and the people we object to. And we have not done that, and as long as we don't do it, I think our democracies, both here and abroad, will be unsustainable. So
pull, if I can, thank you all. Let me pull, if I can, at one common thread in these comments, which is a certain tension between faith and doubt, or to put that differently, that there's sort of two sets of diagnoses here. One says, we've lost faith in democracy. We've lost our faith in political virtues and institutions in the process, and its ability to deliver economic fruits and gains for all of us. The other says we've sort of grown complacent and lost our doubt in democracy, lost our sense of the acute fragility of the risks that it entails, of the dangers of excess, of, there's a way you can look at Madison as birthing the Tocquevillian culture precisely by his doubts about it, that he so structures institutions and imbues the American system with this sense of fragility, that this is an experiment, that it can fail at any moment. That's a very 19th century idea. By the 20th century, we're generally venerating democracy as sort of a wonderful institution with a constitution delivered to us in near perfect form. Is there a way to blend those two things? Do you see a tension between sort of imploring the public to have greater faith in democratic institutions and restoring some sense of their fragility and the need to make sacrifices in order to sustain them?
I think these two things actually go together. So part of the reason why people so I think people feel two things at the same time. Our democracies aren't in danger. They've always been around. Who are you kidding? How could democracy in the United States ever go away? This country's been a democracy for 250 years. And that's a setup for then only seeing the bad things in the system, right? And saying, well, this is bad, and this is bad, and this is bad, because I'm not comparing it to the alternatives. Right? The founding fathers, who had a deep sense of the fragility of our political systems, knew that they might go away and that what might come next would be really a lot worse. And so it gave them a different kind of perspective. Today, young people don't think, what if democracy goes away and we actually find ourselves ruled by the colonels, right? And so as a result, they only see the negative parts of the system, and they don't appreciate how much better the system is than the Soviet Union, than Nazi Germany, than, Russia today, right? And so I think in an odd way, we both need to remind people of how fragile the system is, and in the same breath, tell them what is good about them. And I would add a third thing, not become defenders of status quo. I think it's really important that people who care about the system and who believe in the system recognize that there is some real change that needs to happen in part because of the fragility of the political system. I don't think that if we go another 50 years with no increase in the standard of living for average Americans, that we will still be living in a truly democratic society 50 years from now. I just don't think that you can keep a democracy for 75 years with no improvement in living standards for ordinary people. So there's a reason, not just of economic justice, but of political stability, to care for real change, not because our system is corrupt or can't be reformed, but because it can be reformed because we have to reform it.
So I have a quick answer also that will follow on to some of the things Yascha has said, and it's a two-part answer. I know we've been talking a lot about creativity and curiosity in new ideas. One new idea is looking at the lives and the sacrifices of people who don't live in the established democracies, but who are willing to die for democracy. I'm thinking of the Arab Spring, and I'm thinking both of the versions of it that worked. Many would say Tunisia, I guess, but the ones that didn't. And there are people who are committed to these values. We can use them as examples. The second sort of innovative thought I would offer is that we may not be able to necessarily guarantee in the short run true economic growth of the sort that look like post-war, the post-war period, say, post-World War II period. But we can think about new ideas. Even libertarians, a group that are now being called bleeding heart libertarians, are saying maybe if we want people to take economic risks, entrepreneurs to do new things and risk putting people out of work, maybe we need to think about a basic income guarantee. The Swiss have at least debated it. So there are ways in which, even if we can't get the short run what we want, by looking at what other people are doing, we can reinvigorate our institutions in ways we didn't anticipate.
I think it's important to understand that the tests we think we're experiencing today are not entirely novel tests. I can't say I'm a child of the Depression, but my parents, or World War II, but my parents certainly were. And if you know anything about the history of mid 20th century, the mid 20th century global history, The essential story of the 1930s and 1940s is of in effect, what was a tacit competition among three different social systems. One, the Western democracies, which were perceived to be deeply fragile, to be in a failing condition, to look to be much inferior to the kind of the Bolshevik regime reigning in part through mass terror in the Soviet Union, and then, of course, the Nazi and fascist regimes in Germany and Italy. And nobody in 1933, when the New Deal came to power, would have been 100% confident that the Western democracies would emerge, in a sense, the victors from this struggle. So I think, it's a historian's job always to try to, fill in these, these blanks which disappear from our collective memory. To understand what happened in the 1930s, 1940s, in a certain sense was, I can't say definitive for all time, but was a crucial test of the capacity of different kinds of systems. To look at Britain, really ridden with a terrible class system, still in some ways true today. Yet, the British, the British managed their own way to pull it off. So do we. Democratic cultures discovered that they had enduring virtues and commitments that other societies could not really mobilize except through coercive force, brutally applied. So I think a deeper understanding of, I guess I'm a resilience theorist here, of the resilience of democratic institutions and the appeal those institutions continue to have for people around the world. And I think actually this event having Mr. Khan from Charlottesville describing his immigration from Pakistan, or actually last night my wife and I went to hear our new Attorney General in California, Javier Becerra, discuss his family's history. And you realize that, notwithstanding, the crazy period in which we're now immersed, that the underlying strengths of the democratic system still operate powerfully, not only in the United States, but really in a global sense. I think to me, that's an important source of confidence, which suggests the title for this session is, from my way of thinking, a bit of an exaggeration, or, getting way out ahead of, where the curve is. But I think to understand, we have to ask ourselves, what are the resilient features that have made democratic systems, not just functional, but in a sense, victorious.
This is a great point. Your colleague, David Kennedy, has written about this period, and one of the things that I take from that work is that at the time that democracies were meeting these challenges and adapting to them, many members of those democratic societies saw that not as adaptation, but as capitulation, saw it as the fundamental corruption of historic norms, the trammeling of institutions, that there was a sense that the tension between conserving tradition and adapting to new challenges had gone entirely too far. And yet, in retrospect, the New Deal stands, the social welfare state in Britain stands, and these now look like the adaptations that democratic systems under stress were able to make that more rigid and hierarchical systems were not able to adapt to shifting circumstances with similar power. Do you see that, do any of you see that in this moment too, that we are hobbled to some extent in our ability to adapt by the fidelity to traditional democratic virtues, and yet it is those virtues which may eventually enable the adaptation?
I, in fact, think those virtues are much richer than we've given them credit for, and what we may need is a kind of moral vision or innovation about how to reinterpret them for the modern era. But I don't think that having solidarity, as you said, a kind of multi-ethnic identity, solidarity around it, that's actually quite a very 21st century sort of thing. Although I will say, I appreciate your confidence that we're going to recover, but what I heard this morning about the extension of executive power and the kind of not so great attention to the rule of law has made me think if we will survive, it's going to be because we're more vigilant in demanding and holding our leaders accountable to the ideals that we know have shaped the democracies we value. I hope you're right, but I'm a little nervous, and
I think there's a real danger of Whiggish history, right? So I wrote a sort of somewhat alarmist article once, and I got a great response by email saying, oh, what are you going on about? This is all an exaggeration. At worst, it's going to be another Dark Ages. We got out of those. And, I know that's not quite what you were saying, but I think, if a bright spot is that, after all in the 30s and 40s, after we had World War II and so on, in the end, democracies emerged victorious, if that is the right frame of reference, then I am more scared than I was before I walked into this panel, because some truly horrible things happened in those 2 decades. And B, I don't know that it was inevitable that the democracies were going to win in the 30s and 40s, right? And I'm not into counterfactual history, but you take a few different decisions taken by the Nazi German leadership, or you take a few battles breaking another way. I don't think it's that clear in retrospect that democracies were always destined to win. So I think we have to take seriously this point that democracies can't be taken for granted. The Venetian Republic existed for some close to 2,000 years. And it would be easy for anybody in the Venetian Republic in the 18th century, when you saw its institutional failure, when you saw its inability to reform, when you saw it being in some ways an anachronistic institution, saying, why should we worry? Come on, we've been around for 2,000 years. How could we possibly collapse? And of course, it did collapse, right? So the fact that a political system has had longevity in the past isn't a guarantee that it'll have that in the future. And one way of thinking about that to me is always the sort of fable that Bertrand Russell tells. He talks about a chicken on a farm. And all of the animals on the farm are telling the chicken, be careful, be careful. I know the farmer seems nice to you, but one day he's going to come and wring your neck. And the chicken said, what are you talking about? All of my life, the chicken has come to feed me, and he's come to give me a little bit of seed and muttered some encouraging word. Why would he suddenly change? And Bertrand Russell in his Dry Wit says that, of course, one day the farmer does come to wring its neck, and more sophisticated views as to the uniformity of nature would have been to the chicken's benefit, right? And the point that Russell was making was about sort of scope conditions, right? Like what the chicken didn't understand is that as long as it wasn't fat enough for the market, the farmer didn't have a reason to slaughter it. Once it became fat enough, the sort of thing governing the actions of the farmer shifted. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that were true throughout the period of democratic stability, but are no longer true. Throughout that period, you had a very rapid increase in living standards from one generation to the next. Throughout that period, democracies were the most powerful countries in the world. Throughout that period, civic education was a deep component of our educational system, of our social and cultural life. And I don't think these 3 things are true anymore. So we don't know how democracies behave under these new circumstances.
It's very true. Although I will say that it's sometimes in the darkest times that the most creative ways of thinking about how to save democracy come into being. There's a wonderful essay by John Dewey from 1934 or something like that, called Creative Democracy, the Task Before Us. And in that essay, he's actually acknowledging the dangers of what's going on in Germany in particular, but saying maybe in our particular local context, there are things we can do to kind of revive and sustain and create. Maybe we can hold on long enough so that the rest of the world will catch up again with us. I'd recommend that essay actually to everybody. It's actually, and it reminds us about the idea of democracy as a culture, as a way of life. Dewey actually says it isn't just about institutions and practices outside of you. It's about what you as citizens do to actually make the institutions that govern you, to make them vibrant and to make them healthy and to make them able to do what they do well.
Yeah, one of the big impressions, or maybe I should say confirmations, I took away from this morning's session with Neil Katyal and Jeff Stone and Ms. Yates was, it's worth thinking a lot about the nature of, this would be a component of democratic culture. It's worth thinking about the nature of legal culture in this country. It's worth thinking that something I've thought about really the last decade, every institution of the American government is deeply lawyered. And that's a good thing. It means that every responsible institution has counsel, people who I think are trained through a fairly effective set of institutions of higher learning to have a deep understanding of what respect for rule of law means. Yates's account of how DOJ operates, which I think kind of confirms what I knew, but to hear it firsthand from someone who had worked her way up through the system is deeply reassuring. And I worked with, I did a brief for Neil Katyal in Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. I'm very proud of having done that. But if you think about the Guantanamo things, and one of the interesting things about the whole Guantanamo process is it wasn't just that, let's say well-educated legal academics like Neil wanted to get involved. There are a lot of JAG officers, officers embedded in the military, who are, some of them are probably seeking promotions, may well want to stay in the system. A lot of those officers came forward to represent the Gitmo defendants. And so to me, that's one of those resources. That's what I took. It kind of confirmed what I suppose. But to think how deeply embedded these attachments are in our culture. It's not. Yascha makes some important points, and I think there are important arguments about the correlations between economic well-being and democratic sustainability. And of course that's what came up in the 1930s. I mean, that's what made that argument important at that time.
Quick thing about deeply embedded, though. Amongst some of our young people, I think you've talked about this as well, I'm not sure that democratic values are embedded. One of the most extraordinary things I heard right before the election that Mrs. May just called and didn't do so well in, there are a lot of young people who said, oh, that Brexit thing, I wish I'd voted. And the very fact that something that everybody else in their environment was telling them could be a big deal. And in fact, in some regards, it's the youth in Britain who have the most at stake, I think, in remaining connected to the Union. And many of them didn't care enough or didn't take the time. I don't know if they didn't care. That's unfair. But they didn't take the time to vote. And it's I think, suspected that there might have been a very different outcome. And see, that's my worry. It's embedded in us old fogies, but is it embedded in the way? So I mean, I have some confidence. So I'm, like both of you, a professor, and I deal with young people all the time. And I even have in one of my graduate classes, I had a young man, he was like 27 or 28, who in addition to taking my class was running for office in New York City. I thought, oh, wow, I don't think I could have done that. But he's not the norm. And in many established democracies, I fear that without the effort to really revive an interest in the values that we think democracy promotes and protects, maybe our confidence in the resilience might not be just.
I think in the last, maybe briefly, in the last months, I mean, we're having this debate a little bit in the abstract, and there's a sort of good case study going on at the moment in the United States. And when you look at what's been going on for the last 6 months, I think you see both the optimistic and the pessimistic story, right? So on the optimistic side, there is an incredible outpouring of civic activity. I think some people who perhaps a few years ago said, democracy, you know what, I'm not sure that I care about it, once they see Donald Trump attacking it, perhaps feel a little bit differently about it and do actually start to realize that they have something to lose. There's lawyers standing up for our institutions in all kinds of ways, other civil society organizations as well. And I found it awe-inspiring to see how much of that activity has been going on, how effective some of it has been. At the same time, you also see that it's enough for one person who doesn't have a deep party political base, who wasn't really a part of the political system until a year and a few months ago, to start calling bullshit on various democratic norms that were taken for granted for decades, for a lot of the population to stand with him. For a lot of people to stand up on TV, and a lot of voters to agree that, no, perhaps it is okay to fire the director of the FBI. Perhaps it would be okay if he fires the special prosecutor too.
Let me build on that, Yascha, and turn it into a question, because it's absolutely true. I'm now imagining a phalanx of lawyers protecting fattened chickens for the slaughter from a farmer. You have professionals and bureaucrats who are loyal, dedicated civil servants who are trying to adhere to established institutional norms and protect the smooth operation of the system that they have dedicated their lives to building and serving. We also know that this election showed a stark educational cleavage. It's precisely the people who have professional degrees who tipped most strongly relative to recent norms away from this president. And conversely, it was those who lacked even a four-year degree who tipped relatively strongly toward this president. So we have an educational cleavage within this country, and that's interesting, because if we're describing a system where the educated professionals and the civil servants remain incredibly committed to institutional and democratic norms, and yet at the same time, millions of their compatriots are increasingly skeptical that those norms and institutions serve their interests, increasingly inclined to be open to arguments that all of this is merely theater and an elaborate code designed to keep them and their interests down and to promote the interests of elites. Does that create a kind of a cleavage where even the defense of norms and even the civic culture become the possession of one side of a sharp partisan divide and become politicized in the process? And does that constitute some kind of a threat?
Well, that's what we're about to see. I mean, I think being a historian, I've learned you can only take life one day at a time, and you have to be prepared to be surprised on any given day, as on November 8th or November 9th. And intellectually, I happen to think that's a virtue. We are engaged in a period of political contestation. And it's going to take at least 2 more election cycles, to know how this is going to come out. I used to think, actually, I thought going into this election, the 2016 election would be a decisive election. The Republican Party might break up. It could be like 1854 when, the Whigs break up and provide the base for the Republican Party. Well, it turned out that expectation was wrong. But now the Republican Party faces an enormous set of challenges, which is why I guess Trump is convening the Republican senators at the White House this afternoon. They face an enormous burden of challenges. And the question of, A, can they produce anything? It's not clear the answer to that question is yes. B, if they do produce something, what will be its consequences? C, once it has consequences, how will the electorate react? That's the democratic test our society is about to face. But it'll take, I think, probably 2 more elections to see what the outcome of that process is going to be.
So I think there's another challenge that sometimes it's the elites fail to recognize, and that's that the way we've thought about social policy has tended to increase the divisions. I think particularly race and class divisions, not just in America, but I think in a lot of the established democracies. I would say France, I would say Britain, I would say the US. And there have been a few courageous people, and I hope maybe it takes less than 2 election cycles for this to unfold, but people like Arne Duncan writing, I think it was in the Washington Post, maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, about how maybe we need to start thinking that poor people in Appalachia have something in common with poor people in urban areas who are people of color. If you can't put food on your table and you can't afford a home and you can't get saved to send your kids to the kind of schooling you want them to get, maybe you have more in common. This was Martin Luther King. I mean, this was something so back to my point about reconciliation, that I don't think the changes that will save democracy can only come at the level of the elites. I think people need to sort of demand of the elites that they think of the social challenges that confront us as a nation differently. And I would recommend, this is an op-ed, my father was a public school principal in an urban area in Chicago, and he always said that he was told by book publishers that this was true. Appalachia, you're poor and you can't read. Chicago, you're poor and you can't read. You got a lot in common. We weren't allowed to say it. And some elites managed to, both those who thought they were arguing in service of the people they cared about, they argued in a way that increased social divisions. And maybe some of what needs to happen is not just at the level of elites, but at the level of those of us who want to see less division, to demand that elites think of their role in society differently and think of society maybe differently.
We could probably go on up here for longer than any of you would care to sit in the audience. So I want to take a few minutes and make sure that we're making time for your questions, that there are folks moving through the audience with microphones. If you could just raise your hand and introduce yourself and then state the question.
Yes, Tony Imhoff, I'm from Aspen in San Francisco. I wanted to get the panel's ideas on the recent elections in France and the ability of democracy to reinvent itself, where a party and a candidate, En Marche and Macron, who were hardly heard of a year ago, are now a vast majority.
Look good, Manel.
Well, again, I prepared to wait, but Macron has this fascinating opportunity. In effect, he's created a new party, a new movement. He had remarkable success in the legislative elections, and now he has to come up with a program and see if he can make it stick. But it's, I think actually, the parliamentary vote in Britain Macron's victory, and then I think the expectation that Merkel, should probably prevail pretty handily in Germany. I guess the elections in September, in the fall.
Late September, yeah.
Late September. So that may be a great opportunity for a second breath before we plunge deeply into despair.
A couple of thoughts about the French election. I mean, the first is that it does show to what degree our political systems are in flux in a way that they just hadn't been historically. So at the beginning of the 1960s, Martin Lipset and Stein Rocken, two famous political scientists, made this point that the party structures of Europe seem to be frozen, and North America as well. That after a period of rapid change, now more or less the same parties are always in the system, and sometimes the center-left wins, then they govern for a while, they become unpopular, the center-right wins, it's sort of, there's some alternation, but the basic setup is the same. And that proved to be prophetic for about 40 years. And it no longer is. The party systems in Europe, but also in North America, are now thawing, and in some places they're boiling. And Europe is a great example of, France is a great example of this. You've always had the main candidate of center-left running against the main candidate of center-right in the second round of a presidential election. The one exception, which was a real shock, was 2002, where was the main center-right candidate against Jean-Marie Le Pen, right? Well, now you had an election in which the two people facing each other in the second round of the election were both new. You had a new centrist candidate and a far-right candidate, and nearly a far-left candidate with deep sympathy for Venezuela and Russia and so on would have gotten through to the second round of the election, right? So it's completely in flux, and that is true in Austria, it's true in all of those different kinds of countries. So that's, I think, an important thing to note about the French election. More substantively about Macron, I think what he shows is a simple distinction that, which actually I think applies to Barack Obama in a way as well. We tend to think of him as a liberal, but I think in some ways he was quite centrist and appealed to a lot of centrists. And in the inverse, it applies to Hillary Clinton as well, which is that a centrist politics of a status quo loses. If your line is, our country is already great, just vote for me, I'm not going to change much, things are fine, it is completely deaf to the feelings that people have, to the anger that people have, and you lose. If you manage to mount a centrist politics of change, saying, look, I'm not ideologically radical, but I want to change things, we need to change things, then you can win. And that's what Macron did in France.
What's extraordinary, though, he did it without pulling it back from the idea that globalization is a good thing. I found that amazing. I mean, I'm not the empirical political scientist, so I'm not able to assess it, but I was stunned. I didn't think anybody who talked about globalization could still win. So.
Thank you. Where are the microphones?
Hello? Hi, I'm Glenn Sonnenberg from Los Angeles. My question is that in the rush to teach math and science, we have neglected teaching our students and our future citizens about civics and history. I'd like to hear maybe what you would have to say. I know Columbia has a great books program where everyone is sort of on the same level, but I'm as concerned with primary and secondary education that we really are teaching people about their history and about their civic responsibilities.
Historian should go
What do you think,
first.
Jack? Should we teach more history?
Well, that seems to be a universal point of agreement. I think every session I've been to, whenever the civics question is mentioned, everyone applauds. And, so it's a noble sentiment. And then, I see a lot of high school teachers, precisely for this reason, to talk about the Constitution. Then you come up against everything they struggle against in terms of, how we support education in general in the country and, their workload and everything else. So there are noble sentiments and these enormously pressing problems. And I don't have, just being a working historian, I don't have a magic solution to how you actually get the system to work.
I think the other challenge is there's as much division in what it is they should be teaching as our history as there is in everything else. And that can be constructive if we find the ways to work past the division, but we haven't done that. And I don't think that's going to happen at K through 12. That has to happen, I think, in maybe in the culture at large, and then filter down to higher ed, and then to K through 12. But the division in how we think, whose history, whose version. I'm not one who thinks that. I think there is I mean, I love the core curriculum at Columbia. I think it's wonderful. But there are a lot of people who, why are you teaching those old guys anymore? So,
And also, what is actually a political message?
Yes.
Right? I mean, you mentioned Book 8 of a Republic. I'm going to mention books 2 and 3 of a Republic. But I mean,
Okay.
since the very, very beginning of self-governing republics, people have thought very carefully about how to indoctrinate the young in the values of a political system, because they realized that's the only way it's going to work. That's the only way a political system is going to be stable. And that's true from the beginning of Plato's Republic all the way through the city-states of the Middle Ages to our founding fathers, and we've forgotten the urgency of that. And I think that's something that's certainly true. I imagine when you talk to your faculty colleagues at Columbia and Stanford, I think it's certainly true at Harvard, that if you tell people, look, part of our role is to actually convince people of some of the things that are good in our political system, they would look at you like you're crazy. I mean, there's nothing that any of us have said in this panel today that is nearly as controversial as that in a faculty lounge. And so part of it, and I think this is, it cannot be the version of history of the right, which is, the origin of the Civil War, states' rights, and let's forget about slavery, right? It certainly can't be that, but it also can't be sort of just history as pointing to all of the bad things about our political system, and forgetting to also talk about why it is that despite the real problems that we need to overcome, our system is worth defending. And that's something that I think us on the stage should think about as our job, but everybody in the audience should think about as your job as well, because you all have platforms, you all have influence, and I think that's part of all of our tasks together if we want to save this democracy.
I would add, I don't think you have to also deny the truth about the bad, while also acknowledging that the institutions and the concepts, things like liberty and human equality, these are extraordinary ideas. They are better. Even though I respect the founding fathers, I think Jefferson's formulation of the idea of equality in the Declaration of Independence is an extraordinary thing, and it isn't limited by anything that Jefferson might have had to say about how you apply that idea. It's not his property, it's our property. And that's the way I teach when I teach so I have taught in the second year of the core curriculum, which is actually the contemporary civilization part. That's how I teach the ideas of these dead white thinkers who I think speak to us quite vibrantly about what the possibilities, the best of human political organization can be, even if they didn't manage to realize it in their own practice. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. And I don't think we have to deny the truth in order to tell the good.
Can we get a question on this side? Is there anyone?
Hi, David Nevins from Florida and Pennsylvania. Do any of you folks have any feelings or knowledge about, there's a lot of talk about civic tech and whether that can fundamentally change the way citizens dialogue with their representatives, and equally as important, how representatives dialogue with citizens, and that this is advancing at an incredibly rapid rate, and that will have a fundamental impact on our democracy?
Ideas? I have only the faintest knowledge on.
I mean, I think there are some things that we can do, right? I mean, it is true that, we have 21st century technology and we're living in 18th century institutions. I think a lot of those institutions are right and good, but there certainly are ways in which they can be adapted and ways in which it might become easier for citizens to engage with them. But I actually think that the underlying dilemmas are much deeper than a lot of the people in the civic tech space want to acknowledge, right? So one problem is that people want to feel like they rule themselves. They want to feel like they make all the decisions. And they also want to think about politics roughly 5 minutes a day. And those two things are difficult to reconcile, right? So sure, technologically, we now, John Adams said, the reason for representative democracy, the reason why we have legislators and so on, is that there's too many of us, we're too far apart, we can't all, convene in one place and debate. And so that's why we send our representatives in place. Now, it's easy to say, that's no longer true. We can all join some form of virtual agora online where we vote on the last, funding bill in front of Congress and have debates with each other and so on. The truth of the matter is that that's not what people want. They want to go about their lives. They want to make money. They want to hang out with their friends. They want to play Xbox. They don't want to spend all of their time on politics. That's not how modern liberty works. It's not how modern politics works, right? And so I think there's a really deep division there. And there's a second deep division, between the need for expert rule and the need for international coordination and the fact that our politics is being hollowed out. So on the one side, if you want to deal with climate change, well, it needs to happen to some degree beyond the nation state. It needs to involve experts in the environment and economics and so on who actually understand what solutions are going to be effective. But once you start delegating those kinds of decisions to technocratic bodies, to international organizations, people rightly feel all of these different things are being taken out of democratic contestation, and I no longer have a real voice in all of these. Now, how do you reconcile those two things? I don't know. I think that's a deeper problem than it's going to be solved by sort of a cool app that engages people in some voting procedure.
Will you jump in?
There's a lot of interest among some political scientists in the practices of antiquity and the idea of actually reviving ancient deliberative procedures, both as a model of what democratic experience might be like in that classical antique sense of the term, but also as a useful supplement to modern decision making. For example, I have a colleague and good friend at Stanford, Jim Fishkin, who does what's called deliberative polling. He's done this around the world. He has a big project going on in Africa. He's done it in the PRC. He's done it for the EU. He did it for the Greek socialists, and so on and so on. Basically, what you do is you require people to engage in kind of moderated deliberations for which they have to prepare themselves. They have to do some reading. They have to engage in discussions, which actually have moderators, so you make sure that kind of rules of fair deliberation and discussion are applied. You have a chance to ask questions about, from select experts where you want clarification. To me, the cyber world is an exciting way to think about this with all kinds of scary implications, but I'm inclined to sign up with the political scientists and say, there are these ancient techniques which might actually have a lot more promise than we recognize if we give them a fair trial.
I think that the deliberative Democrats are onto something, but I think there's another layer, and I think part of it is we don't see the role of citizen as a genuinely political office, which I think it is, and I think there are things that citizens can do, so you have your town hall with your legislators and representatives, but how do we interact and engage with each other? In the 1990s, when there was a lot of violence at Planned Parenthood offices that in fact resulted in people's deaths in Brookline, Massachusetts. As a consequence of that, I think the head of the archdiocese and some governmental figure in Massachusetts said the two sides need to get together. They could only do it in secret, but they did it in secret for 5.5, almost 6 years. And as a result, the violence was de-escalated. It didn't solve the question about what to do about abortion. That's a different sort of challenge. But the idea that we would de-escalate and stop people from killing each other over something we cared about is, to my mind, as much a part of political life and part of the role of the official role of a citizen that is not going to be pursued properly by what you say to your legislators. It's what we say to each other. And it might be that the deliberative democracy model needs to be supplemented by kind of place for certain kinds of public conversations that we have, where we're not trying to decide anything, but we're trying to figure out how to treat each other as human beings and people we respect, even when we disagree. So that's my addition.
I end up covering a lot of that space and a lot of contemporary political movements. I'm reminded of an online plebiscite in the UK to name a new vessel that yielded the winning name, Bodie McBoatface, which I think usefully illustrates the danger of a promise that tech can make this easy. If we can make it much easier to vote, you just log on, spend 2 seconds, click the funniest name, and log off, that this may not actually yield the desired outcome. But I think what each of the panelists have shown us over the last hour is that democracy is incredibly hard work. And it's work that falls, it's not work that we can usefully delegate. We can delegate some of the responsibilities and deliberative processes. That doesn't excuse our own civic obligation to engage in the process, to think through issues, and to put in the labor necessary to sustain a system. And I think that's probably a good note to leave it on here, that democracy may be in some trouble, but we have the capacity ourselves to provide the solutions. Please join me in thanking our panelists today.